I'm recording right now,
Okay.
and I'll figure out a way to transfer this to you.
Okay.
I should have started recording before I started talking. It's up to you now.
Okay. Perfect. So can
Start your presentation.
yeah, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Perfect. Great. Thanks, Guy, and thanks for those of you who've chosen to tune in and listen this afternoon. My talk today essentially is I changed the abstract a little bit. I've been debating on what exactly to speak about, and as you can see by the title of my presentation, it's fairly long enough. But essentially, what I want to give is a big picture perspective of risk in the post-COVID world, and the way that that I've been seeing it in the work that I do. And today I'm essentially trying to focus this from the lens of regulation and what regulation can and should be doing, especially moving forward, and interweaving how I think PSM can be an appropriate model to help regulation, particularly in the post-COVID world, and looking at the different aspects of risk that we're observing. So that's sort of my topic. It's I'm not I'm not sort of positioning it purely as a PSM presentation, but I'm trying to align it with concepts in the philosophy of PSM with the broader elements of risk. So before I start, I do want to thank the PSM for the award bestowed on me. I'm truly humbled. In fact, I feel this is a validation for me personally to have chosen to do the work in public interest, and the award certainly has inspired and motivated me to continue doing so. Especially humbling for me because they have received the award, and as I look to the colleagues on the PSM committee, including previous winners like Marcello, Arturo, and Graham, and others like Adrian, from whom I continue to learn and get inspired by. So this is something very special to me. So I also want to mention the true sort of inspiration for me has been my father, Dr. Mallikarjunan Mangalam, who was a chemical engineer by training and profession, and who was instrumental in establishing India's first government research institute on industrial safety and risk analysis after the Bhopal accident in 1984. So his work in risk analysis and process safety always fascinated me very early on, and I've tried to be like him, doing investigations of incidents, understanding causes, and finding solutions to real-world risk problems. So I certainly want to thank him for the inspiration he's provided. Very quickly, I set up the Institute after having worked for 13 years with Ontario's Technical Standards and Safety Authority. Some of you know me in that role. And I left the organization in 2016 to start a nonprofit organization called PRISM, where really the intent of the work that we do is to create a platform for facilitating discussions on risk and bringing stakeholders from various fields of expertise and areas to try and create solutions that are collaborative in nature and address risk in the appropriate manner. So really, that's been the primary objective, and that's taken me to doing work and not only in various sectors around, but also in various geographies around the world, which I'm certainly blessed and lucky to have done. So, and the people that I work with are again extremely passionate about what they do in science and engineering and law and sociology, policy, technology, a whole range of areas. So what I'm talking about today is a manifestation of all the work that has been happening from the Institute and with our partners over the last 3 years, and certainly what we have observed in the last 6 to 8 months seems to resonate with the work that we do, and validate the direction that we've been proposing, particularly on the way risk is being managed through regulation. So I'll give some of the perspectives that I have from that angle today. On my presentation, I'll give a brief background on some of the impacts of COVID, most of which you've seen, but I do want to make the connection between all kinds of impacts that COVID is related to, and what the emerging risk dimensions are as a result, and how these emerging risk dimensions can be addressed, particularly through regulations, and what the COVID scenario has impacted the regulatory landscape, and what the emerging thinking around regulatory practices are in general, even pre-COVID, but since COVID, and where I see a strong PSM connection, and why I believe PSM can play an important role. And there were some interesting comments made in yesterday's presentation about looking at broadening the application of PSM into other sectors, and I'm certainly a strong advocate for that. I know we heard of the presentation from Enbridge on how they're addressing it. So I'll talk about some of those aspects too. So quickly, COVID impacts. The one impact we know is on public health. As of this morning, 43 million people have been affected. 1.1 million people have died as a result. You're seeing an average of about 200,000 cases every day. So this is, purely from a public health standpoint, a catastrophe of massive proportions. What people don't also realize is the impact it's causing in a whole range of other development objectives around the world. So according to the UN and the World Bank, they estimate that nearly 1 billion people could face acute food insecurity by the end of the year. And that may be resulting from shortages of labor to produce food, the access for farmers to sell their products in markets because of issues like lockdowns and transportation, etc., and just the supply or the diminishing supply of perishable commodities. I work a lot in sub-Saharan Africa, and I've witnessed some immediate impacts there, where people have broken borders to try and access food, just basic food products, impacted by lockdown, and some pictures that I took while I was there in early March of this year, just as the pandemic was about to erupt. It's had impacts on businesses and trade. The WTO has reported the lowest in its trade index findings in the last couple of years. It really hit a bottom in March. In April of this year, it's picking up. Seems to be picking up slowly, but certainly it's impacted business and trade significantly. COVID's had impacts on education. They estimate that nearly 1.4 billion students of various levels are negatively affected by the pandemic, and that's we don't know the consequence that it'll bear on their ability to get back and participate in the work labor force in the future. So that's a massive impact. It certainly has impacted the labor market. The lockdown, for example, pretty much shut down India. India had the worst impact from the lockdowns in terms of the labor market, and many countries face the same. Particularly the countries where there's dependency on informal migrant labor. The pictures that you see in the bottom show how lockdowns forced migrant laborers who didn't have jobs to essentially walk hundreds of miles back to their hometowns, and the one picture on the right, which shows this man on the phone crying, captured the imagination of people in India. He couldn't even be there for his own son's funeral, who died of COVID because of the lockdown, and there was no transportation, so he had no jobs, and he couldn't even get in time. So the impact on labor has been significant. On gender, and people have been talking about this, but if you some of the statistics are staggering. We do know that women form a significant portion of the healthcare sector. And if you look at examples from Europe that are emerging, females tend to be far more affected by almost double than male health workers in terms of infections. There's certainly issues around domestic violence, and countries are starting to see increases in gender-based violence domestically for a variety of reasons. And one of them, of course, people don't appreciate and acknowledge that women tend to be representing the highest unpaid care and domestic work, and now they're in situations where there's security, health, and financial worries that affect home. They're living in cramped conditions. You have men staying longer at home because of these lockdown issues. Their movements are restricted, and as a result, you see increases in domestic violence. What's probably even more relevant to the folks in the technology sector is that they found that nearly 80% in the UK, 80% of women in the health force, for example, didn't find PPEs suited to them. So they were we know that PPEs are designed for keeping men and male in mind, and that showed in terms of the impacts or the effectiveness of PPEs on women. So here, as you see, stats show that 84% of women had experienced problems, one kind or the other, with PPEs, ranging from sizes and the way they were suited for them, etc. Everything from masks to clothing. So there are serious design issues that seem to have been exposed as a result of this impact. One thing I would suggest is you please stop me, ask any questions as we go along. We don't have to wait till the end. We've also seen some examples of impact in areas like industrial safety. India, again, pick India as an example here. They've had nearly 30, as last count, 35 industrial accidents since COVID, and many of them directly as a result of COVID and associated issues like lockdowns. I contacted an expert I know in industrial safety in India who sent back this email to me reporting why these incidents are happening. He chose to be anonymous, but he said that there are some very basic problems that companies don't have a good understanding of routine shutdown, restarting procedures. Most of the industries have manual operations, and many of them are operating with 30% capacity, even though they're going full force. There are no proper standard operating procedures for restarts post-lockdown, and issues such as these are emerging. So I had 75 people already known to have been killed as a result of these incidents. Although Beirut, the explosion in Beirut was not directly as a result of COVID, but we do know that the consequences of the explosion are being exacerbated further by the fact that you are having a country that's dealing with the pandemic, having severe political issues, and the worsening economic crisis. So all of this is making the issues much worse for them in terms of everything from rendering them homeless, increasing poverty rates, and a whole range of issues. So just the sheer impact of the explosion on the population is incredible. So what I see as emerging from the context of risk dimensions are three main issues. One is that it's not that this hasn't been known for risk experts, especially that there are interconnected systems at play. You know, when we undertake, for example, risk models, we tend to simplify risk models and ignore these interconnected systems, and that manifests itself in the way policy decisions are made. And now what COVID's done is that it's exposed the fact that there are interconnected systems. Whether we talk of supply chain, whether we talk of manufacturing, whether we talk of food, etc., they're all interconnected systems. And the second risk dimension is that they continue to magnify that there are systemic causes that are leading to some of the failures. And the third part, which is I think critical, which while being recognized in certain quarters, doesn't seem to be addressed equally, is our cultural risks. And I'll talk about what I mean by cultural risks, both in terms of the socioeconomic and behavioral aspects, but also in terms of trust that people have in institutions, etc., which I believe is an important factor that needs to be considered, and probably a gap in systems like PSM that need to be addressed moving forward. So if you think about the consequences of interconnected risks, the World Economic Forum, which produces a global risks report every year, identifies the extreme interconnectedness that for example, COVID has demonstrated. You know, the impact it has had from everything from weather and water-related issues to migration to social instability to technological aspects. So they're incredibly interconnected risks, and the consequences are being faced as we speak. There's a greater recognition of the systemic causes, and again here, if you look at what the World Economic Forum identifies them as: economic, societal, geopolitical, technical, and environmental. And these are systemic causes that, if not addressed in a manner that's considering these systems and the interconnectedness, will lead to failures again in the future. So unless you deal with these systemic causes, you're going to continue to face similar situations as we move into the future. The socioeconomic impacts of COVID, again, we've seen that laborers in the lower income bracket, particularly in the essential work spaces, are the ones who are at the highest, exposed to the highest levels of risk. You know, people in personal care aides, nursing assistants, licensed nurses, etc., who form the lower income bracket, but are in essential services, are the most vulnerable, and therefore have the highest occupational risk. The likelihood of people in the vulnerable populations, as we've seen, are also a likelihood of them dying as a result of COVID is magnitudes higher, depending on what's causing the vulnerability, whether it's housing problems, unemployment, poverty, food insecurity, etc. We've also seen that there's been both a demand and supply shock on the different types of professions. So people on working in service sectors like restaurants, etc., have had to deal with both the demands and the supply shocks. Airline pilots, for example, have had to deal with demand shocks because now travel has come down significantly. Whereas on the other extreme, you've seen an incredible demand on essential workers like healthcare, etc. In terms of what people and experts are perceiving as risks, as key risks, clearly the epidemic, the virus itself, is on top of everybody's mind, and it shows that they consider that as their biggest concern, and then social aspects and economic aspects, including unemployment, is seen as important. And if you look at it at the data by age, for example, most of the younger people seem to feel that social progress is at risk, whereas people older than 50 seem to think that economic growth is at a far greater risk than social progress. The way people are behaving in terms of their response is also changing. That you see that more people are looking to make their purchases, for example, based on companies that are more socially and environmentally responsible, that they care for the health of employees, that they deal with their social obligations, etc. So there is certainly there's an impact in the way people are responding to the epidemic in their behavior patterns as well. And if you look at what the senior management across companies are looking at, they feel that majority of them feel that this crisis will fundamentally change the way business will be done over the next 5 years. So there's opportunities for innovation and disruption in the way that the business gets done. And the last aspect of the cultural risk that I wanted to raise is the trust in institutions. And by trust, what I mean are the different dimensions, whether it's the physical trust of feeling safe, whether it's the emotional trust of your emotional societal needs being safeguarded, whether it's informational trust, where you feel that your information that is being collected is secure, and the financial trust. And what we're observing is that we're seeing record highs in terms of trust across all institutions, whether it's government or business or NGOs and medias. And this is an opportune time for the various sectors to make sure that this trust that they've gained across the board shouldn't be lost in the way decisions are made moving forward. Certainly, there's a range of levels of trust across, for example, expert voices in terms of who's telling the truth, scientists and doctors and health officials and health experts seem to have a higher degree of trust now since before. And even government leaders seem to have increased their levels of trust over a period of time. So the questions that need to be considered, irrespective of what role you are in terms of the ecosystem that you operate under, is the following: that should we consider, and if so, how do we model these interconnected risks and the multidimensional consequences? My answer is yes, but the challenge is how do we actually do this? Have we accounted for the diversity and range of evidence and views and perceptions of risk, which is important in terms of the way we manage risk moving forward? Are we measuring the right set of outcomes of our actions and interventions? And our actions or interventions fair and proportionate and equitable and consistent across the board? And whatever the responses are, the responses provide the opportunities for us as a collective to revisit objectives, whether these are societal objectives, whether these are individual or organizational objectives. That this is a good opportunity for us to look at whether we've got the right ones in place, and then course correct our path to progress in order to achieve these objectives. I think the time is very ripe for innovation, but I think what we have to start thinking about is a responsible innovation, and certainly the idea of disruption and disrupting businesses is also going to happen, but more and more we're witnessing that these need to happen in a collaborative manner, and that in isolation will again impact these interconnected risks. And the connection to regulation is that I believe that having agile and progressive regulations can facilitate us being able to respond in the right way in achieving all these objectives that we may have in mind. So just a quick sort of idea as to what regulation does is regulation essentially endorses societal objectives and creates societally accepted guidelines and rules to achieve those objectives. So the first group that would have to think about revisiting societal objectives would be the government and the regulators. Do they have the right objectives in mind? Are they setting the right rules and guidelines to achieve those objectives? And objectives need to take into account both harms and the opportunities that such crises create. The benefits of regulations that we have seen over time, that economic regulations are aimed to improve economic and market efficiency, whereas social regulations aspire to achieve social outcomes, and on most occasions by correcting the damaging effects of economic activity, and in an ideal scenario, producing outcomes that are better than those that we achieve from the markets. Regulatory objectives help facilitate equitable access to service and goods. It helps create a market and a business environment that's fair and responsible. It's supposed to help protect the environment and citizens and workers from harms. What and you'll see a little more about what COVID's done in terms of exposing these as there are limitations of regulations. There clearly are either perceived or actual conflicts between economic objectives with desired social outcomes. There are several such examples. If you think about the policies that are made towards energy conservation may have impacts on other aspects. And regulations tend to focus on single sectoral risk environments as opposed to looking at the interconnectedness, as I mentioned. So they're either technology based or they focus on health or transportation, etc. So they're not necessarily looking at the multidimensionality and the interconnectedness. So they're being focused on single or sectoral risks tend to make them operate in silos, and those silos need to be broken. And many times competing social outcomes are not addressed adequately. So how do you deal with, for example, which we're witnessing is while lockdowns may address public health issues, how is that going to impact long-term aspects such as food security or poverty or mental health, for example? So such competing outcomes are not adequately addressed by regulations. And the thing we've seen with the emergence of technology, especially, is that they're generally misaligned with innovations, and they're generally misaligned with the way business models are evolving, because they're always playing catch up. Regulations generally tend to be reactive, and because they're reactive, they're not able to align themselves with business models, and this has to change. So if you think about the regulatory landscape that CODE's impacted, and I've just captured a few. Everything from exotic species, which may have triggered the virus itself, to public health, to the way we envision transport, and to the way supply chains operate, to the way we deal with healthcare and the medical sector, to employment and labor and education and food, and the way we protect our seniors. Every aspect of the regulatory landscape you could think of has been touched, either directly or indirectly, and the consequences are being borne by all of us. So COVID's clearly exposed this. So some gaps that that's identified in the regulation, as I mentioned, is that the cross-sectoral implications of the interconnected risks aren't addressed. Regulations simply cannot keep pace with the changing source and nature of risk because they're sector specific. Regulatory approaches tend to focus on processes rather than outcomes. So if you think about the regulators you deal with, they're almost always interested in compliance. They're not looking at the broad outcomes, and this gets worsened through red tape and bureaucratic inefficiencies, and also many regulators tend to perform because they're afraid of legal ramifications. If they don't focus on process and don't look at compliance, they're afraid that they may be held liable for failures that may happen. Whereas when you start looking at outcomes, you would have a very different perspective and how you deal with your regulatory obligations. The other aspect that was exposed very early on is there has traditionally been very little cooperation between regulators and industry who may be in a position to support failures, and generally as a global ecosystem, there's been very little cooperation. There's a big inequity in terms of the way information is available and shared. Lack of trust in systems and processes, and people have delayed information gathering and sharing. So if you just think about the whole idea of contact tracing and the way different geographies and different cultures have dealt with it, has been very interesting to just observe. And these inequities and information that leads to us not being able to address risks appropriately, because there's going to be uncertainties in the way we measure risk. Some of the positives that we're starting to see emerge is that this certainly is an acknowledgement of the interconnectedness of systems and associated risks. So where this will lead to in terms of decision making is yet to be seen, but certainly there's an acknowledgement. There's a recognition of the huge inequities, whether it's social or economic, as a result of actions that have been taken. And there's a desire to engage and consult and trust and empathize and collaborate across the board. And we are seeing several examples where people and organizations and the private sector, everyone's striving to experiment and innovate in more disruptive ways. And this is where regulation really needs to come in and help and facilitate the processes to do the right things. So where we certainly would like to see shifts in regulatory thinking, and it's happening, is that we get out of these spaces of prescriptive regulations, which just are outdated, that we need to move towards more performance, risk, and outcome-based regulations. I know there are challenges with these, but I think that's certainly the way to go. That'll certainly help address some of these interconnectedness aspects. There is a lot of discussions around balancing the accountabilities for regulatory outcomes, that there has to be a discussion on burden of proof and who's having what burden of proof. Certain societies, and we've seen historically in Canada, particularly in Ontario, that the regulators tend to assume a greater burden of proof, which seems very strange. Whereas if you see in Europe, that the burden of proof is typically assumed by the regulator, and rightfully so. In which case that the regulations should facilitate and provide the necessary means and instruments for the private sector to be able to address that burden of proof adequately. There's a demand for guidance, and I'm in this context, I'm saying standards, for example, to assist in meeting these performance or risk-based regulatory outcomes. Risk certainly is becoming a currency for any conversation around regulation, no matter what sphere you talk about. And because it is becoming a currency for regulatory outcomes, I think it's important that we have the right methods in place to adequately identify, monitor, and understand and measure risk. That's critical. And how we ascertain root cause for risk is essential for interventions. And the part that I will talk about briefly is that we expand the conversation around risk, that not just limited to technical, technological, or systemic risks, but also start looking at cultural risks in this context. The regulators are now demanding and looking for a wider range of intervention choices in their toolkit, so that they can focus more so on monitoring and addressing organizational cultures and behaviors, as opposed to just focusing on compliance, and that they want to be able to provide incentives to the private sector to have the right culture and the right behaviors moving forward. And I think that's where the PSM type approach would certainly benefit regulators to start thinking about. The other aspect is that they're starting to recognize that one size doesn't fit all when they deal with non-compliance, that you have such diversity in the markets and the players, that they have to have a whole range of tools when dealing with non-compliance. There are some emerging practices coming in from the UK. I have just put some examples here. And there's also a lot of interest in adoption of standards into regulation. Canada and especially has had a lot of experience, particularly in the technological sectors, but you're starting to see this more in other sectors. And I just wanted to highlight a couple of standards that I'll briefly talk about. Canada's new Underwriters Laboratories 2984 standard on managing risks in the public interest has emerged as a useful guide for regulators to start thinking about how they will apply risk in the way they make decisions. There is the concept of ethical business regulations, which is coming out of the UK, and I've been working with the proponents of these actively, where the idea of a regulation and a regulator is to focus more on promoting ethical business practices among businesses to achieve social outcomes, and less so on traditional approaches to compliance. And I think process safety management standards have a role to play in this context too. So what the UL 2984 essentially has some foundational principles for managing public risk. While it's focused on regulators, it applies to anybody who's looking at managing risks in the public interest. Talks about how decisions have to be made consistently, that there has to be consultation and communication. It has to be science and evidence based. Talks about fairness and independence in the way decisions are made, that they look at interconnectedness and look at integrated approaches. And these are principles that are explained in detail in the standard. I won't go into it, but it at least provides some amount of guidance for regulators to start thinking differently in the way they approach risk. And it again acknowledges, highlights, and recognizes the interconnectedness and the multidimensionality risk and the way it needs to be dealt with. So the silo approaches that currently exist have to be replaced with more integrated approaches. It provides a framework. I think this chart will be familiar with those who know the PSM standard. This is actually a chart that was created by Marcello as part of the standard itself. So the key parts is that it creates upstream governance requirements around how regulatory governance is set up in terms of setting objectives of regulations and the way this regulatory structure is established and how it's delivered to the typical risk management framework that you see and how it impacts an individual corporation or organization. So it covers the entire spectrum of a regulatory ecosystem. Ethical business regulation, on the other hand, is more of a conceptual, a theoretical model that still is finding its way into actual practice. But what it's based on, it's based on this concept of trust. That ultimately a regulation will only succeed if the relationship between a business and a regulator is built on trust. And the way you would build that trust is by collecting evidence of the fact that the business is doing the right thing. And the right thing in this context they talk about is having ethical business practices, and that the regulator recognizes this and encourages the commitment towards having these practices. So it's very much a trust-based regulatory framework, and the key part are two things: is how do you define what the right thing is, right thing to do is, and what is the type of evidence that's required for a regulator to be able to acknowledge that the business is doing the right thing and then promote that aspect. So it's a theory that's most promoted by Professor Christopher Hodges from University of Oxford, and it's gaining a lot of prominence, not just in the UK, but even with the federal government of Canada, which is looking at shifting many of its regulatory frameworks and approaches to becoming more aligned with the concept of EBR. And what the ethical business practices talks about is again the idea that a business looks at being able to create an ethical culture where the employees are influenced and encouraged to do the right thing based on ethical values. An example of what they mean by ethical culture is this concept of levels for organizational consciousness, that the employees look at their organization as just not merely one that's interested in the bottom line and creating financial incentives, but all the way to being a responsible company in its community by serving as a socially responsible organization. So how does a business be able to one, establish and maintain this culture, and two, how can it provide the evidence to the regulator that it's doing so continuously? And if it's doing so continuously, then the regulator has an obligation to incentivize them to continue to do so and get out of the way, essentially, have them continue the way they're operating. And a big part of this idea of ethical business regulations is regulating through culture. And what they mean by this is that they have to move away from a blame culture to a more open and just culture where organizations are allowed to learn and deal with their mistakes. Some examples that you can think of is in the airline safety management, the entire safety management system that's built around the way airlines operate globally is based on just culture, and the regulators recognize and acknowledge this, that it can't operate on a blame culture. You do have these unfortunate situations like what happened with Boeing along the way, but in general, if you look at the trend that at least the accident trend that you've seen over the last 10, 15 years since the safety management system culture emerged, is that they have seen significant decreases in not only the frequency of incidents, but also the severity of incidents resulting from airline accidents. In fact, I think 2018 was the first year in the history where there was no civilian death. There was no death as a result of civilian accidents involving planes, which is quite a remarkable approach. And the way they've arrived at that is by having this just culture approach and a safety management system approach. So there's a lot to learn from sectors such as the airline industry. And it has been this idea of ethical business regulations being put into place. The Scottish Environmental Agency now, for example, has a range of tools that they're able to apply based on their observations of culture of organizations, where they actively recognize good performers and champions, and then have these tools to deal with enforcement tools to deal with the deliberate or conscious bad players in the system. So, and a lot of this is based on risk and evidence that's been collected to reflect the culture of organizations. And I think there's a lot of similarities, if you see, with the foundational pillars of PSM. If you think about process safety leadership, it really talks about setting and maintaining a culture of doing the right thing within organizations, creating accountability, and creating the culture within organizations to operate in an ethical and right manner, and assuming responsibility across the organization. That the focus is on understanding from mistakes, understanding and learning from hazards and risks, and applying them in the way that you design your risk management solutions, and then continually improve your process. So it's very much similar to the ideas of things like ethical business practices and just culture, etc. So the benefits from a PSM-based regulations is that there's a focus on, as I've said, setting and practicing the right value, measuring and doing the right thing, focusing on science and evidence, the way we understand issues and risks, and managing risks through proportional response, whether it's through systemic, behavioral, or technical interventions, which I believe are well captured within a PSM approach. And certainly the focus on outcomes and continuous improvement. Where I think that the PSM, in my view, can be broadened in terms of how it's applied to real world opportunities is, so I think to start looking at the philosophy of PSM to other human technology interfaces systems, and not just think about it in a sort of a restricted process industry space, and also expand the scope to other social outcomes, because I think it's important that now that we know what the interconnectedness of risks and their consequences are, that we need to start looking at expanding the scope to other outcomes. Certainly, we have an opportunity to incorporate this idea of culture risk into risk assessments, and how do values and ethics and inequities play into the way that we measure risk and deal with risk. So, and when you're designing systems, for example, just as an example, is do we consider gender as a factor, and how do we deal with this? So I have sat in standards meetings, for example, in elevators, where the elevator is designed assuming an average adult male in mind, and it really is that the right way to look at things. So we start looking about at incorporating these aspects into culture risk, and examining the impact of the interconnected risks on a much broader set of outcomes that are not just limited on one's own business objectives, but broader social objectives too. So the questions for us as a PSM community certainly to consider is can the definition of process and therefore process safety be expanded? And I've given some thoughts about this. I work with for example, the seniors in the long-term care sector. And protection of seniors can still be done through a process safety management approach. How about online marketplaces and the issues of safety around online marketplaces? And as a result, can the application of the PSM standard be broadened to apply and cover more sectors? And should, as a result, should regulations and regulators start considering and adopting and enforcing PSM standards more actively? And just as an example, and I think I mentioned it the other day, the Ontario government recently approved the adoption of the PSM standard into regulations through the Operating Engineers program that the TSSA administers, and I think that's a very, very positive sign. And there's a commitment by the government and the regulator to start looking at the PSM standard in the other sectors that they apply, whether it's elevators or boilers or the other sectors too. So that's my presentation. I certainly want to use this opportunity to thank all the collaborators and partners and clients that we've worked at over the last 4 years, and the ideas are not just mine, but have emerged through a collective thinking and partnership. So I'll stop there and happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
I've certainly got one or a few, Srikanth. And first of all, thanks for a really excellent high-level presentation. I just regret that we're not at a live conference where we could spend an hour or more beating around some of these ideas afterwards, because it's really refreshing to see it coming from this sort of level. Now, with the ethical basis, of course, there's that question of whether the ethical needle is swinging more over towards something driven perhaps more by Nietzsche and Ayn Rand than social responsibility, but we'll assume for the moment that it isn't. I guess my main concern over this is that this difference between chronic risk and acute risk, where in the PSM area we tend to be much more focused on acute risk. And the problem with maintaining political will and commitment when the awareness of these events decays very rapidly after they've happened. And from a sort of ex-industry guy observing regulators from the outside and wondering when things are going to happen, for example, with provincial ministries of labour on stuff like major accident prevention. I really get the sense that, except in a few cases like TSSA, the regulators are sort of dragging their heels, and there seems to be very little political will there to do something about acute risks. What's your view on that? Is it actually starting to change in the provincial ministries of labour?
Well, the answer is, well, thanks, Graham. I think it's not an easy answer. I think what's important is to try and understand, which we're trying to do, is understand what's the motivation for regulators to behave in the manner that they are behaving. And in almost all the cases, it is the pressures that they're under, and it's the limitations and the constraints that they're put under that they're behaving in a manner that might seem short-sighted, for example, in this case. So I think, as I mentioned, I think there's systemic issues that I can't pinpoint, and there needs to be a collective effort to start looking at systemic issues. So, for example, the idea of moving towards a no-blame society. So Scotland, for example, established a policy to say all regulations shall be based on a no-blame culture, right? So just as a simple policy direction that's constituted by the government will go a long way, for example, for regulators to start engaging the sector in a much more collaborative and partnership way and looking at these risks. So I think there are systemic issues, and to appreciate and understand that regulators across the world have the right intentions in mind. They're very much driven by the motivation to doing the right thing, but the constraints that they're facing are quite significant, and those constraints need to be addressed by as you say, political will and direction. And it's happening. It's happening in small pockets. And what happens is that many of the regulatory jurisdictions are waiting for examples. And so they're afraid to be the leaders to doing so. So when you start throwing these examples of Scotland and New Zealand and the other jurisdictions who are moving that direction, there seems to be a greater amount of courage to move in the direction. And I think ultimately you do need some kind of a political will. And I'm hoping that we are seeing some shift in that direction. I mean, there are exceptions to it, and I don't want to name the jurisdictions which come to mind, but I think what you are seeing is a shift in the needle there. So I'm an optimistic guy, and I think if we don't make use of the opportunity that we have now, then we failed as a society. I mean, I think that's and I don't want to think about it being that way.
I describe myself as a cynical optimist.
So am I.
Yeah, I appreciate what you're saying there, and I think that Francois, when we get to the discussion for the PSMD on where it's going from here. Perhaps since the standard is now out there, the time has come for some sort of more collective outreach to the appropriate government agencies, particularly the ministries of labour, to have another crack at sensitizing them about this.
Yeah, I do have to say, and I think I don't think there's Sujoy on the call. I have, from the outside, I have not been very impressed with the Ontario Ministry of Labour. So I think that if there's one organization that we may have to have an outreach quite early, it's probably them. I think there needs to be a culture shift and change with them. So for sure.
Thank you.
Francois, you had your hand raised at one moment.
No, it wasn't my hand raise. It was a clapping according to Zoom. So I'll do it for real. Thank you. You said you were humbled by the prize. I had the privilege of being one of the reviewers of the package that was presented for your nomination. I was humbled. It was a very thick curriculum vitae it is a very thick curriculum that you have. Congratulations.
Thank you so much, Francois.
To raise a question, I'm curious about PRISM. So nonprofit, who else do we know that is part of it beside you? How do you, who's there? Are your collaborators just invited for one project, or you have a permanent team?
I've consciously chosen not to make this a long organization of having employees, but I prefer to work with collaborators. So I have, depending on the projects and the nature of work, I have collaborators across the sector. The other challenge, Francois, as you can imagine, is because the idea is to create a platform that brings multiple sectors into place. I'm not in a position at this point to hire people in such diverse spectrum. So I do rely more so on collaborators. So one of the things I have done is we have formed. So we have a very small employee base, but we have formed partnerships with institutions, including academic institutions. So I work with University of Waterloo in Canada, one university in the US, Southern Methodist University. I work with University of Queensland in Australia, University of Oxford. And we have partnership with Mars in Ontario from a technology perspective. I'm able to engage collaborators from various spectrums in their organizations depending on the need. So.
Okay, and how do you get the funding? So even if you have a good pension fund somewhere, if you're traveling and.
Yeah. So it's interesting that you bring it up. So I talked about my dad being a mentor. I went and met his boss when I decided to start this institution, and I told him what I wanted to do, and he looked at me and he said, "This is a very noble thing you're trying to do, and you have to do it. But let me tell you something: you're not going to make money." So, and he said, "Well, it's your choice now. Do you want to make money or do you want to do the right thing?" And he said, and he told me, "I know what the answer is." I argued with him. I said, "I think I could make money and do the right thing at the same time, but I am leaning towards the fact that there's no money in this." But to your point, as of now, the majority of the funding has come from either governments or donor institutions. So I've been lucky to work with the World Bank and other donor agencies, and about 70% of my work right now is in developing countries. I do very little in developed countries, largely because for the issue that Graham has raised. I think we're not short of solutions in this part of the world. I think we're just short of the desire to do the right thing. I think there's a big inertia from a culture shift, and honestly, I don't have the time and patience to go and change cultures of Ministry of Labor, for example. And if it doesn't come from within, then it'll never come. So So I've focused largely on issues to deal with in the developing world, and in that regard, institutions of the bank have been my primary sources of revenue at this point. So.
Thank you.
So thank you so very much, Srikant. A very informative talk. We are cutting into Hadis's time now. So I guess we have your email and we can communicate with you later if we do have further questions.
Absolutely.
So I will stop recording now and